Original group member Glenn Rhee meets his end at the hands of Negan on part 4 of our Walking Dead character spotlight on comic history. What's up guys, Roman from R&S Entertainment here, and welcome to this week's episode of Comic History, the video series where I retell, explain, and give context to the iconic storylines, origins, and events in the world of comics. Before I started Comic History, I used to make similar videos for the Walking Dead comic book series, but instead of covering the entire story like I generally do in comic history videos, character spotlights would follow one specific character's entire journey through the comics from introduction to death, allowing me to focus on that character's story while still talking about a ton of Walking Dead continuity along the way. I've done multi-part character spotlights for Tyrese, Abraham, Axel, and now with part 4 I will be wrapping up the full spotlight on fan favorite character Glenn Rhee. I've also done a normal comic history episode talking about the first volume of the Walking Dead comics overall, so if you're a fan of The Walking Dead, make sure to go check those videos out as well. Glenn is a character introduced to us right at the beginning of The Walking Dead in issue number 2, and along with Rick, Andrea, and Carl, is the only original Survivor group character to make it to issue 100 alive, which has Glenn finally meet his end at the hands of new villain Negan in his first introduction into the comics during the Something to Fear story arc, along with appearing briefly in issue 101 as a corpse. Glenn's death is not only shocking and impactful, but signifies a turning point in The Walking Dead's ongoing story structure and pacing. As Negan tells Rick in issue 100, they are entering a new world. Glenn's death serves to shift the status quo into a larger scaled world overall, as the recently discovered Hilltop community is opening the doors to other established groups like Negan and the Saviors. During part 4 of our in-depth character spotlight for Glenn, along with focusing on Glenn's character arc and the significance of his character, we are going to be talking a lot about the Walking Dead continuity around this time, and how Glenn's death changed the series moving forward. In each part of the Glenn spotlight so far, we've talked about Glenn's journey and character progression through 25 issues of the comic series. In part 1, we saw Glenn's resourceful and creative nature and his easygoing, relatable personality, along with his burgeoning relationship with Maggie, cement his place as both a useful member of the group and a fan favorite character. In part 2, we saw Glenn face the horror of the governor and get officially married to Maggie. And in part 3, Glenn found his place in a new society as a supply runner of Alexandria. We pick back up with Glenn where we left off in part 3, on his first supply run for Alexandria, a community of people who had survived the apocalypse by remaining undetected within a walled-off township. Glenn had naturally fallen back into his skills at traveling by rooftop and navigating around large herds of zombies in a city environment, following Alexandrian supply runner Heath to a pharmacy to retrieve medicine needed to save the life of the injured runner Glenn had replaced. After finding what they need, Glenn and Heath return to Alexandria by motorcycle, but the noise attracts the attention of the group of survivors who had thrown their own men to the zombies to escape in part 3. Glenn goes back to his family, tucking his adopted daughter Sophia into bed before planning to go back out on another run the next day, as the supply runner had died due to his injuries shortly after they returned. After Sophia is asleep, Maggie turns Glenn down for sex, which he points out she's been doing every night. Eventually, she opens up to him that even though she's no longer suicidal, she still feels exposed, knowing that he saw the dark parts within her. Glenn tells her he loves her, not just the parts of herself she showed him at first, and they come together and kiss. The next morning, a funeral for the deceased supply runner is disrupted by the sound of gunshots outside of Alexandria's walls. And when Rick and the others run to see what is happening, they find the leader of the group who had followed Glenn and Heath standing outside of the gate. Their group trains a sniper on Rick, demanding to be let in and to relinquish anything they have. Andrea proves to be a better sniper, however, and quickly dispatches the one aiming at Rick before Alexandria counterattacks with heavy fire and strong fortifications, killing every single one of the attackers but also making a massive amount of noise with the gunfire, attracting every zombie within a large distance of the town. Glenn is part of a small team led by Abraham, formed to kill the zombies massing at the gates, and initially they're very effective, working their way along one side of the fence with Glenn letting Abraham call the last zombie head smash. Suddenly, a warning shot from a high-powered rifle is fired by Andrea, and Glenn and the others hurry back around to the gates to find a gigantic zombie herd gathered right at the gates of Alexandria. Glenn and the group sprint forward and throw open the gates, but Bruce, one of Abraham's construction crew, is bitten on the neck and dies on the way inside. With Alexandria quickly being surrounded on all sides by the massive zombie herd, Glenn approaches Rick with the plan of taking a small group outside the walls to bring supplies to Andrea, who was now stranded in the bell tower outside with no way of getting back to the town, along with hopefully drawing some of the zombies away from the walls while they're out. A group is quickly assembled including Glenn, his supply running partner Heath, and Spencer, an Alexandrian who at this point in the comics is trying very hard to be romantically involved with Andrea. As a grapple line is thrown to a nearby rooftop to provide them a way out, Glenn is sent off by Maggie and Sophia, who after pulling him close in a group hug have tears streaming down their faces at the thought of him going out in such danger. Heath and Glenn shimmy across the rope above the outstretched arms of zombies gathered below them, with the rope even leaning low enough from their weight to let one of the zombies almost grab onto Glenn's backpack. After the two make it across, Spencer attempts to follow, but the line snaps, leaving him to fall within walking distance of multiple zombies. As Glenn and Heath struggle to pull him up to them, the line suddenly gets a lot lighter as Andrea, who had seen them from her position in the watchtower, had gone to meet them halfway, helping them pull Spencer up and saving his life. They then watch as a portion of the Alexandria walls fall inward, letting huge numbers of zombies stream into the city in a conflict that I covered much more in detail in my Abraham character spotlight. Glenn begins to panic, saying that they're all going to die. Andrea tries to formulate a plan to help, knowing that with how many zombies are in their way, they could never drive a vehicle through them, and if they use fire or explosions, they could burn their own city down around them. Spencer approaches her and says that she should leave with him and abandon the others, to which Andrea punches him in the jaw and says to stay the hell away from her. Glenn's group manages to fight their way slowly by foot back to town, finding that Abraham and Rick had rallied the people of Alexandria to fight for their homes in a giant bloodbath where they killed the entire herd. This success leads Rick to an epiphany that the zombies, even in great number, were ultimately a manageable threat, meaning that for the first time there is real hope for their futures. Later, Maggie asks Rick to stop Glenn from going on the next supply mission, which makes sense anyway because instead of sending a small, fast group like normal, Rick is going with multiple people and heavier weaponry. While Rick takes Abraham, Michonne, and Andrea, who are most of their group's heavy hitters, on the supply mission, Alexandrian citizen Nicholas, who has been dissenting more and more as Rick's group has de facto taken over Alexandria, approaches two other citizens saying that Rick was just using them, and that they needed to kill him and his group before Rick gets everyone killed. Nicholas then notices Glenn, who had overheard the whole thing, and prepares to kill him before he can tell Rick about his plans. Glenn tells Nicholas that it doesn't have to be like this, pulling out his gun in fear. Nicholas punches Glenn in the face and wrenches his gun away, pinning Glenn to the ground and hitting him again and again before pointing the gun at his head. Glenn punches his attacker in the dick and manages to escape, running to his house and screaming for Maggie to get her gun and find Sophia. Glenn takes the gun and locks his wife and daughter upstairs, and Nicholas causes a scene outside, attempting to rile up the other Alexandrians to revolt against Rick and his group. When Nicholas threatens to come in there and kill Glenn's entire family, Glenn runs out with his gun raised. But before either can shoot each other, Rick's voice bellows out demanding answers. As the visibly terrified Nicholas weakly says that he's taking Alexandria back, Rick says, "Really? He's gonna take the town back from Andrea, who has her sniper rifle trained on his forehead, or from Abraham, Michonne, and Glenn, who all have their weapons at the ready? Or from him, with Rick brandishing his gun, saying that Nicholas has no fucking idea who he's talking to." Nicholas quickly surrenders, with Rick showing mercy to him and his people, saying that he does not want to get them killed, and that in fact they need the Alexandrians to sustain the rare success of a community they had created here, establishing the pecking order with Rick firmly at the top. Later, Maggie goes with Glenn on a supply run to see how they do things and feel better about him going out regularly. And when they return, Sophia acknowledges that she knows Maggie and Glenn aren't her actual parents for the first time since her birth mother Carol's death, showing that she is finally more able to cope with reality. Eventually, Glenn accompanies Rick with a small group to investigate the Hilltop, a community brought to their attention by a scout named Paul Monroe, though he goes by Jesus. Jesus brings them to Hilltop and shows them a seemingly thriving community of over 200 people, though there are a notable lack of firearms. After an attempted assassination on the current leader of Hilltop, Jesus tells Rick, Glenn, and the others about a man named Negan who had shown up at Hilltop the moment it was set up with heavily armed thugs, who demanded half of everything Hilltop has. Food, supplies, basically anything Negan wanted, in exchange for protection from zombies, which Negan's group, the Saviors, had apparently cleared thousands of already. Hilltop's weak leader Gregory had rolled over to Negan's demands, and the Hilltop had lived in fear of his group since. Carl looks at him and says if they kill the Saviors, will Hilltop give them half their food? And thus Rick ends up striking a deal for a massive amount of food and supplies for Alexandria in exchange for him and his people dealing with Hilltop's Negan problem. The next morning, Rick approaches Glenn, who is drinking a cup of coffee looking out at Hilltop, and Glenn tells him that he really likes it here, that the community was close despite having more people than theirs, that there were more jobs to go around and more land in their safe zone. Rick cements their alliance with Hilltop and they prepare to head back to Alexandria, with Rick stopping to tell Glenn and the others that this is the start of a new purpose to their lives. New possibilities brought on by the promise of larger numbers and organized communities working together and rebuilding the world from the ground up. This signifies a turning point in the main storyline of The Walking Dead, from Rick and the others' ever-constant quest to simply survive in this new world the zombie apocalypse has left them with, to restarting civilization from scratch and creating a new world with what they have. One could argue that Kirkman not only followed the logical progression of civilization's downfall to chaos to eventual reconstruction, but also prepared to alter The Walking Dead as a story on a fundamental level post-issue 100. On their way back to Alexandria, Glenn and the others are stopped by a small band of thugs on motorcycles who demand that they surrender everything they have and lie down on the road in the name of Negan. Rick, not intimidated in the slightest, casually says, "Okay, we'll give you everything," and then signals Andrea to blast one of the men's heads off with her rifle, leading to Michonne leaping out with her sword and beheading another, which the surviving thug says will not please Negan. Rick says to ask him if he gives a shit, and says that Negan's protection racket on the Hilltop was over, and that Negan could now pay Rick half of everything he has for their protection. When they finally return to Alexandria, Maggie runs to Glenn and pulls him into a hug, and when he says that he won't leave her again, she interrupts and says that she's pregnant, that despite them trying and it not happening earlier, she had confirmed it with the doctor. In issue 98, the severity of their new conflict with Negan and the Saviors is brought fully into light as Abraham and Eugene are ambushed on a trip outside of the walls, resulting in Abraham's death, which was massive, as Abraham had taken up the place of second in command and kind of co-leader / potential rival to Rick, following Tyrese's death in the conflict with the governor. For more information on Abraham or Tyrese, make sure to go check out their character spotlights as well. Following Abraham's death, Glenn approaches Maggie and tells her that he wants to leave Alexandria, and Maggie gets Sophia to leave the room, fearing that the progress she had made would be undone if she found out about the attack. Glenn says that if Maggie wants Sophia to be happy, if she wants the baby to be safe when it's born, then they needed to relocate to Hilltop. He says that he knows it's hard considering leaving Rick and the others, but that he believes in the potential of Hilltop, and that it is truly the safest decision for their family. She does promise to follow him if he wants to go, but is still uncertain about it herself. Rick organizes a group to travel to Hilltop and inform them of their confrontations with Negan's Saviors, and Glenn says that he wants to go as well, and then not come back. Glenn tells Rick and the others in their group that Maggie is pregnant, and that Hilltop has more doctors, less of a chance of violence, and that he's sorry, but he just wants to keep his wife and children safe. On the road, the group is forced to stop and camp in the vehicles overnight, and when Rick changes guard with Michonne, he notices that Glenn is lying wide awake. Glenn tells Rick that his mind is racing with thoughts about the baby and what life was going to be like at Hilltop. Rick says that he's going to miss Glenn, but congratulates him on the baby, to which Glenn says that things are moving so fast, and that for the first time in forever, he can't stop thinking about tomorrow. Later, while Rick is on guard duty, he's ambushed by Negan's Saviors, who hook a noose around his neck and drag him down as the others pile out of the van to find a massive army of people, armed with everything from chainsaws to automatic rifles. Completely outgunned to the point of literally not being able to do anything, the group sees Negan for the first time, sauntering out of the crowd with his trademark baseball bat Lucille slung over his shoulder, saying that if they haven't pissed their pants yet, they were about to. Negan kneels down to Rick and says that he does not appreciate Rick killing his men, and then killing more of his men when he sent them to kill Rick's men after his men were killed, and that in general it was not fucking cool. Negan continues to say that Rick and his people work for him now, and their new way of life is going to be centered on making sure they kill, steal, or find enough to give Negan half of everything they have from this point on. When Rick doesn't reply, Negan orders his men to line them up, casually smiling and saying that he doesn't want to kill any of them, because hey, they can't bring him their shit if they're all dead, but they had killed a good number of Negan's men, and for that they did have to fucking pay. Brandishing Lucille, Negan shows it to them and says that now is the time for him to beat the fuckity fuck out of one of them with his bat, and all that's left is to decide who gets the honor. With his big grin still plastered on his face, Negan looks around Rick's group, saying that he definitely couldn't bash the mother or child to death, that Carl looked way too interesting to kill, that he couldn't pick Glenn because people would call him racist, same with Heath, and that he'd like to do many things to Michonne, but killing her is not one of them. Leaning down to Rick, he says that he definitely can't kill Rick and make a one-handed badass martyr for his people to worship once he's gone, and that instead they needed to see him break and bend the knee to Negan instead. Negan throws up his arms and says that he simply cannot fucking decide, and after smirking to himself for a brief moment says that he's got an idea. Pointing Lucille at each member of Rick's group, he starts going through eeny, meeny, miny, mo, and when the rhyme is finished, it lands on Glenn, who stares up at Lucille wide-eyed for a moment before being hauled to his feet and dragged away. Rick stands up and starts to protest, and Negan yells that he's got 50 men surrounding him, and to sit the fuck down or all of them die. Negan says that if any one of them moves again that they'd cut Carl's other eye out and feed it to Sophia. And when Glenn is brought before them, he says that they're allowed to breathe, they can blink, they can cry, but they had better not move. Negan raises Lucille, and Glenn says please don't, as Negan slams the bat down directly onto Glenn's head, saying that he's taking it like a champ, as Glenn rolls over and reveals his face, with an eye popped entirely out of its socket and his skull crushed in. Rick and the others are frozen, horrified as Glenn tries to stutter out a last word, with Negan casually leaning in and saying, "Hey, you in there, buddy?" As Negan continues to go on, Glenn interrupts him and manages to scream out the word Maggie. And at that moment, Negan gleefully takes a swing at his face, breaking his jaw and teeth out and sending him crumpling to the ground. As Negan sees that at this point, Rick and Michonne are the only ones not looking away and crying, he calls them a bunch of pussies and says that Lucille is thirsty. He proceeds to bash Glenn's already destroyed skull with the bat over and over, and when he finally stops, he laughs at Glenn's completely obliterated head and brains on the ground, saying that Lucille is a vampire bat. Rick tells Negan that he's going to kill him with tears streaming down his face, and Negan leans in and gets him to repeat it before standing open-armed in front of him, saying that Rick's best chance to kill him is right now, that he could drive a knife or axe into him before his men could even stop him. He leans in close and tells Rick that if he keeps acting tough, Negan will let his men run a train on Rick's son, which he later reveals was a complete bluff, as once we learn more about Negan's character, we find out that he has no tolerance for rape of any kind in his group, especially not children, which is an important distinction from the last major villain of the series, the Governor. After punching Rick in the face a few times, Negan says that he's entered a new world order, and that they all belong to Negan now. As he and his men load up to leave, he says that they'll be showing up for their first offering, i.e. half of Alexandria's supplies, in a week, driving away and leaving our characters traumatized and defeated with the remains of one of their dearest friends on the ground. Suddenly Maggie hauls off and punches Rick in the face, calling him a coward and hitting him again and again, saying that he should have done something, that he might as well have killed Glenn himself. Rick silently takes the beating, and even asks why she stopped, turning to see that Carl had drawn his gun on Maggie, telling her to stop hurting his dad. Sophia tackles Carl and bites his hand until he drops the gun, and when the fighting is broken up, the group tries to decide what to do next. Maggie says that Glenn had wanted her and Sophia to move to the Hilltop, that he had believed it was safer there, and that that's what she was going to do. She also says that she wants Glenn buried at Hilltop instead of Alexandria, and when Rick tries to apologize, she cuts him off and says, "Don't." After arriving at Hilltop and informing their leader about what had happened, Rick tells Maggie that he and the others have to get back to Alexandria, and crying, she says that she understands, and that everyone at Hilltop had been helpful and supportive to her, and were planning a memorial service for Glenn, and that she thinks he was right about it being the safest place for them. She pulls Rick into a hug and then says that he can't let Negan get away with this, and Rick says that he'll do everything he can not to. And that wraps up part 4 of our Glenn character spotlight from The Walking Dead. Although it has taken way too long to finish, I hope you guys enjoyed it. And although I am not going to announce or promise any more Walking Dead character spotlights just yet, it is likely that eventually I will do another, and not let it take so long to finish. Glenn is a fan favorite character in The Walking Dead for a reason. He's a rare, normal guy in Kirkman's apocalypse, though as we saw in previous episodes, he was a little less normal than he appeared when he revealed that he was actually a car thief and not a pizza boy before the outbreak. His relationship with Maggie grew and matured from what was essentially a casual hookup out of necessity and boredom to one of the most well-developed romances in the entire series, of which there are more than you might assume. Glenn's death is brutal but earned, as Rick had been making some very headstrong decisions upon learning that the scope of surviving humanity is bigger than he initially thought, pretty much declaring war against a group that he knew nothing about, with only the assumption that his own group were the most prepared and most dangerous people around. Abraham and Glenn, two of the most important and long-lasting characters of the comics to this point, both being offed by Negan or his men in short succession, is trademark Kirkman style. And though some would call it cheap shock tactics, I would disagree. These characters were not taken out of the story lightly, and in fact ushered in an entirely new era and direction for The Walking Dead post-issue 100. As Rick says throughout these lead-up issues into the Something to Fear arc, things are changing and growing in a way they hadn't before. Civilization was beginning to sprout up in increasing size and sustainability, and for the first time since the book began, our characters see the hope of a possible future. This is significant. As for the entire series so far, The Walking Dead was about Rick and the other characters' ever-constant quest for survival in the zombie apocalypse, and the means and lengths they were willing to go to achieve it. Post-issue 100, the story shifts and is now about rebuilding humanity and civilization from the ground up. That's a very different story, and though it follows the same characters and continuity, we see the changes in the comic series only become more drastic from there. I believe that part of this is Kirkman's ability to follow a story and characters to their logical next steps. Eventually, humanity would band together and find ways to actually rebuild a real society in this new world. When the outbreak happened, civilization was reverted mostly to small bands of hunter-gatherers. And despite early failed attempts at sustainability like Woodbury and the prison, this is how the state of humanity stayed until this point. These story arcs are the lead into a grander scale and a different goal, which personally, after 100 issues, I feel is earned and is handled very well by Kirkman for long after issue 100. If you enjoyed this video or are a fan of comics and want to see more awesome stories and other content, make sure to give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to RNS Entertainment, check out the comic history playlist for all of the episodes we've done so far, and make sure to follow all of my social media via the links in the description box below. If you want to support my channel and get access to exclusive content, go check out my Patreon at patreon.com/RNS Entertainment. I want to give a huge shout out to Drew Miles and Jason Cantu for being $10 or higher patrons this month, and I will see you all next time.